We lived on the outskirts of a small town, where our house stood at the edge of a sprawling forest. That forest was a constant in our lives, a world of adventure and wonder for my younger brother Danny and me. We built forts there, explored its winding trails, and dreamed up fantastical stories of hidden treasures and magical creatures. The trees were like old friends, their shadows familiar, comforting even. That morning felt like any other. The air was crisp, the sun peeked through wispy clouds, and the scent of pancakes drifted through the house as Mom cooked breakfast. Dad was fiddling with his old radio in the living room, muttering about poor reception. I was finishing a comic book in my room, deciding whether to meet up with a friend later. Danny was already tugging on his blue jacket, bouncing near the front door. "Don't go far," Mom called over her shoulder, her spatula still in hand. "I won't." Danny grinned, shoving his hat onto his head. His last words stuck with me. "Maybe I'll find something cool." The door shut behind him, and I watched through the window as his white hat bobbed between the trees until it disappeared. It was such an ordinary moment, so mundane, that it didn't register as the last time I'd see him like that. Carefree, whole, and so very much my brother. At first, we didn't notice anything was wrong. The hours passed, and Mom's mild concern turned into unease. She stepped out onto the porch, calling Danny's name. No answer. By late afternoon, she was pacing the yard, her voice rising in pitch each time she called for him. "Danny, it's time to come home." Her words echoed into the trees, swallowed by the forest's indifference. When Dad returned from searching the familiar trails, his face was drawn and tight. "He's not there," he said simply. Darkness fell, and the forest changed. The welcoming trees now loomed, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying a chill that wasn't entirely from the weather. We called the police that night. 2 officers arrived quickly, their flashlights piercing the growing darkness as they questioned us. "He knows the forest well?" one asked, scribbling in a notebook. "Like the back of his hand," Dad replied. His voice wavered, betraying the strength he tried to project. Neighbors joined the search, their voices calling Danny's name into the abyss of the woods. But the forest responded only with silence. The deeper they went, the more alien it seemed, as if it had swallowed Danny whole and was mocking us for trying to retrieve him. That first night dragged on forever. I sat in my room, staring at the trees outside my window. Each gust of wind that rustled the branches made my stomach clench. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, just out of sight. The next morning, the police set up a base near the edge of the woods. They scoured every trail, every clearing, but found nothing. It was as if Danny had simply vanished. By the 3rd day, hope began to fade. Mom was barely holding herself together, her face pale and drawn. Dad sat in the living room, silent, gripping a cup of cold coffee he never drank. And then the door opened. At first, we thought it was a neighbor, maybe someone bringing news from the search party. But when Mom saw who it was, she gasped so loudly that her mug fell from her hands and shattered on the floor. Danny stood in the doorway. He looked fine, completely fine. Pale, yes, but uninjured, his blue jacket and white hat spotless, as if he hadn't spent 3 days in the forest. His shoes weren't even muddy. Mom fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around him, her sobs breaking the tense silence. "Where were you?" "We were so worried." Danny didn't answer at first. His eyes flicked around the room, resting on me for a moment before looking away. I got lost," he said finally, his voice quieter than I remembered. Dad approached cautiously, resting a hand on Danny's shoulder. "How did you find your way back?" Danny shrugged. "I just did." It seemed like the kind of answer you'd expect from a confused child, but something about the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. His tone was too flat, too calm. That night, as Mom tucked him into bed, I peeked into his room. He was sitting upright, staring out the window at the forest. He didn't turn to look at me, but he spoke anyway. "It's quiet there," he said softly. I didn't respond. I just closed the door and went back to my room, my chest tight with an unease I couldn't explain. In the days after Danny returned, we all tried to act like everything was normal. Mom was overjoyed, doting on him endlessly. She made his favorite meals, tucked him in at night like she used to when he was little, and tried not to ask too many questions. Dad, though quieter, stayed close to him, always watching, always ready to step in if Danny needed something. And me? I wanted to believe everything was okay. I really did, but the feeling of wrongness clung to me, heavy and suffocating. Danny wasn't the same. At first, it was subtle. He was quieter, slower in his movements, like he was constantly lost in thought. He didn't laugh or smile the way he used to, and his eyes, they were different. How almost like he was looking through us rather than at us. One night, during dinner, I noticed how strangely he held his fork. It was an ordinary gesture, but his fingers gripped it awkwardly, as if he'd forgotten how to use it. Mom must have noticed too because she asked, "Are you feeling okay, honey?" He looked at her and gave a small smile. "I'm fine," he said. His voice sounded normal, but there was no warmth in it, no real connection. It was like he was mimicking what he thought a normal response should be. It was little things like that, piling up over days, that made it harder to ignore. One night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, barely audible, like a soft scratching against wood. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind or a tree branch brushing against the house. But the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I got out of bed and opened my door cautiously. The hallway was dark, but the light from the moon filtered through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows. I followed the sound down the hall. It was coming from Mom's bedroom door. Danny was standing there, his back to me, one hand pressed flat against the wood. His fingers moved slowly, scraping lightly across the surface. "Danny," I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't turn immediately. When he finally did, his movements were slow, almost mechanical. His face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't sleep," he said simply. His tone was devoid of emotion, as though the idea of sleep was foreign to him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his room. I stood there for a long time, staring at the faint scratches he'd left on the door. Things escalated after that. Mom started finding strange marks in the kitchen every morning. At first, it was just small smudges of dirt on the counter. She assumed it was one of us forgetting to wash our hands. But then she noticed the knives. They'd been moved. Every morning, they were lined up in a perfect row, their blades gleaming under the kitchen light. And sometimes, there were fingerprints on them, smudged muddy, like someone had handled them during the night. "Did you or Danny touch the knives?" Mom asked me one morning, her voice trembling slightly. "No," I said truthfully. She didn't say anything else, but I could see the worry etched into her face. That night, she locked the kitchen cabinets before going to bed. The next morning, the knives were back on the counter, lined up perfectly. The locks on the cabinets were intact. Mom started sleeping with her bedroom door locked after that. I began noticing other things, too. Danny never went outside anymore. He used to love the forest, spent hours exploring its trails, climbing trees, and hunting for frogs near the creek. But now he seemed to avoid even looking at it. Instead, he spent hours in his room drawing. I passed by his door one day and saw the floor covered with sheets of paper. On each one, he'd drawn the same image over and over: a dark forest with impossibly tall, thin trees. And in the center of each drawing was a figure. It looked human at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the legs too thin, and its head was featureless. "What are you drawing?" I asked from the doorway. Danny didn't look up. "It's him," he said. "Who?" He paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. "The one who was with me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean? Who was with you?" Danny finally looked at me, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "He's still here." That night, I had my first dream about the forest. I was standing in the middle of the trees, the air thick and heavy. The sky above was black, no moon, no stars. And all around me, I heard whispers. They didn't come from any direction. They were everywhere at once, overlapping, incomprehensible. I turned in circles, trying to find the source, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. And then I saw it, the figure from Danny's drawings. It stood motionless among the trees, its long arms hanging at its sides, its head slightly tilted as if observing me. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the figure began to move toward me, its limbs bending and shifting unnaturally as it approached. I woke up gasping, my sheets twisted around me like a cocoon. When I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked wrong, sunken, tired. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to confront Danny. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The light from the morning sun illuminated his face, and for the first time, I noticed how pale he'd become. "Danny," I said, sitting across from him, "you need to tell me what's going on. Who's still here?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "He doesn't like it when you ask questions," he said. "Who doesn't?" Danny smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll see." Dad barely spoke anymore. He spent most of his time staring out the window toward the forest, his face lined with something deeper than exhaustion. Maybe he was wondering the same thing I was. How could the forest have given us back Danny, only to twist him into something we didn't recognize? It was 3 nights later when the scratching returned. I woke up in the early hours of the morning, my room bathed in shadows. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it again, a faint, deliberate sound like nails dragging across wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the hallway. Slowly, I crept to the door and opened it just enough to peer outside. The corridor stretched out in dim moonlight, its walls shrouded in a faint silver glow. The scratching was louder now, coming from farther down the hall. Danny was there. He stood with his back to me, facing Mom's bedroom door. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his right hand moved slowly, rhythmically, tracing shapes on the wood. "Danny," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He stopped but didn't turn around. His hand dropped to his side, and for a moment, the silence was unbearable. When he finally turned, it was slow, deliberate. His face was bathed in moonlight, but it wasn't quite his face. His skin seemed too tight, his features slightly blurred, as though someone had pressed their hands over clay and reshaped it just enough to be unsettling. "What are you doing?" I managed to ask, my throat dry. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my stomach twist. They weren't Danny's eyes. They were too dark, too wide, and filled with something I couldn't name, something that wasn't human. "I'm listening," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Listening to what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back to his room, his movements jerky and unnatural. I stood there for a long time, staring at the faint scratches he'd left on Mom's door. They weren't random marks. They formed a pattern, a series of long, deliberate lines that almost looked like symbols. The next morning, Mom noticed the scratches. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked me, her voice trembling as she ran her fingers over the marks. I hesitated. "Yeah, I saw him." Her face paled. "You saw Danny?" I nodded. "He was drawing on your door." She didn't say anything for a long time, but I could tell she was struggling to process what I told her. Finally, she whispered, "We need to do something. This can't go on." That afternoon, I walked past Danny's room and heard him humming. It wasn't unusual for him to hum when he was younger, but this was different. The melody was slow, monotonous, almost hypnotic. I knocked softly. "Danny, come in," he said. I pushed the door open and froze. His room was a mess of papers, each one covered in strange, intricate drawings. They all showed the same thing, a dense, dark forest with towering trees that stretched endlessly into the sky. In the center of each drawing stood a figure, tall, thin, its arms impossibly long, its head featureless. "Well, what are these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Danny looked up at me, his expression blank. "It's him," he said simply. "Who?" "The one who brought me back." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" Danny stood and walked over to his desk, where a fresh drawing lay unfinished. He picked up a pencil and began adding to it, his strokes deliberate and precise. "He's waiting," Danny said, not looking up, "and he's getting impatient." That night, the dream came again. I was standing in the forest, the trees around me impossibly tall and close together, their trunks twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching toward one another like skeletal hands. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and indistinct, whispering my name. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, a directionless sound that seemed to surround me. "Danny," I called, my voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, becoming a cacophony of voices that made my head spin. And then I saw him. The figure from Danny's drawing stood among the trees, motionless but watching. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its body impossibly thin, and its head tilted slightly, as though curious. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure began to shift, its body bending and twisting as it moved toward me. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as it came closer, and just as it reached out with one impossibly long arm, I woke up gasping for air. When I told Mom about the dream, she looked at me as though she wanted to believe it was nothing more than my imagination. But the fear in her eyes told me she knew better. "Do you think he's dangerous?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to look out the window, her shoulders tense. "I don't know," she said finally. "But whatever he is, it's not Danny anymore." That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway again. This time, they didn't stop outside Mom's door. They stopped outside mine. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the scratching, faint but deliberate. "Let me in," Danny's voice said, soft and almost pleading. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, I thought he'd gone. But then I heard him whisper through the door, "He's coming for you next." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every sound in the house, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the windows, felt like a warning. I stayed frozen in my bed, clutching the blanket tightly around me, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any moment. When morning finally came, I stepped out into the hallway. The house felt different, heavier somehow, as though it was holding its breath. Mom and Dad were already in the kitchen. Mom sat hunched over a cup of tea, her eyes red and swollen. Dad stood at the window, staring out at the forest like he'd been doing every day since Danny came back. Neither of them spoke. I cleared my throat. "He was outside my door last night," I said. Mom's head snapped up, her face pale. "What do you mean?" I told them about the footsteps, the scratching, the whisper. Dad's grip on the windowsill tightened, his knuckles white. Mom just shook her head, whispering, "This can't be happening. This can't be happening." "Something's wrong with him," I said. My voice was steady, but inside, I was shaking. "That's not Danny. Not anymore." Mom opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, she just stared at the table, silent. That night, Dad decided he'd had enough. "I'm going to get answers," he said, his voice firm in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. "What are you talking about?" Mom asked, alarmed. "I'm going to talk to him. I'll find out what the hell is going on." "Don't," I said quickly, panic rising in my chest. "You don't understand. He's not safe." Dad scoffed, grabbing a flashlight from the counter. "He's my son," he said. "I'm not going to be afraid of my own damn kid." We tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He went to Danny's room, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as he walked down the hall. Mom and I stayed in the kitchen, too scared to follow. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Finally, the sound of Dad's footsteps returned. He walked back into the kitchen, pale and trembling, the flashlight dangling loosely in his hand. "What happened?" Mom asked, rushing to his side. He didn't answer right away. He just sank into a chair, his hands shaking. "His room," Dad finally said, his voice barely audible. "There's something in there. Something not right." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat tight. Dad shook his head, as if trying to clear the memory. "The walls. They're covered in drawings. Symbols. The same ones you saw on the door." I exchanged a glance with Mom. "And Danny?" she asked hesitantly. Dad's face darkened. He's just sitting there, smiling. After that, Dad locked Danny's room. For a few days, things were quieter. Danny stayed inside, and we didn't hear from him. At first, it felt like a relief, but the silence didn't feel safe. It felt like the calm before the storm. Then the noises started again. It was late one night when I heard the first creak of the floorboards. I stayed in my bed, too afraid to move, listening as the footsteps passed my door. They stopped at Mom and Dad's room. The scratching came next, slow and deliberate. I forced myself to get up, adrenaline pushing me forward despite the fear. When I peeked out of my room, the hallway was dark, but I could just make out a figure standing by their door. It wasn't Danny. The shape was taller, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an angle that made my stomach churn. It was tracing symbols on the door with one elongated finger, its movements disturbingly precise. I ducked back into my room, shutting the door quietly. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, and waited. The next morning, Mom found the symbols on her door. They were deeper now, carved into the wood rather than scratched. She didn't say anything at first, but her hands were shaking as she cleaned them with a cloth, as though scrubbing them away would make them meaningless. Dad tried to act like everything was fine, but I could tell he was scared. We all were. That evening, I overheard Mom and Dad arguing in the living room. "We need help," Mom said, her voice frantic. "From who?" Dad shot back. "Who's going to believe us? There's something wrong with him." Mom snapped. "You saw those drawings. You saw what he's done." "I don't know what I saw," Dad said quietly. "But we can't just..." His words were cut off by a loud thud from upstairs. We all froze. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable creak of a door opening. It was Danny's room. We ran upstairs together, but when we reached his room, it was empty. The window was wide open, the curtains blowing in the cold night air. His drawings were gone, the walls bare except for faint outlines where the paper had been taped. Mom stared at the empty room, her hand covering her mouth. "Where is he?" she whispered. None of us had an answer. That night, we locked every door and window in the house. Dad kept a baseball bat by his side, and Mom stayed up all night in the living room, refusing to go to bed. But he didn't come back. Not that night. 2 days later, I was walking through the backyard when I noticed something near the edge of the forest. It was faint, but it looked like a trail of footprints, barefoot, the toes unnaturally long. They led from the woods to the house, and then back again. My stomach churned as I followed the trail to our back door. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. Inside, the kitchen was quiet, the morning light streaming through the windows. But on the counter, neatly arranged in a perfect line, were the knives. Their blades gleamed, and on the handles, faint but unmistakable, were smudged fingerprints. That night, I dreamed of the forest again. The figure was there waiting, its head tilted, its arms outstretched, beckoning me. And I swear I could hear Danny's voice. "Come find me." 2 weeks passed, but Danny didn't come back. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were waiting. Mom and Dad barely spoke to each other anymore, and when they did, it was in hushed, broken sentences. I spent most of my time locked in my room, avoiding the kitchen, the hallways, the windows. But the forest was always there, looming just beyond the backyard. Its shadows seemed darker, deeper than before, as though the trees were conspiring to hide something. And maybe they were. One night, just after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving through the house. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped outside my door. For a long time, there was silence. Then came the whisper, "Let me in." It was Danny's voice, but it wasn't right. There was something behind it, an echo, like two voices speaking at once. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whisper came again, this time more insistent. "Let me in." And then the door handle turned. I bolted upright, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and braced myself. But the door didn't open. Instead, the handle slowly turned back into place, and the footsteps retreated down the hall. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. But on the floor, just outside my room, were muddy footprints. They led toward the stairs and stopped abruptly. The next morning, Mom was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She looked exhausted, her eyes hollow and rimmed with dark circles. On the counter, the knives were neatly lined up again, their blades gleaming in the pale light. "I heard him last night," I said, breaking the silence. Mom didn't look at me. "I did too," she whispered. "He was outside my door." Her hands were trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. "We can't stay here," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "We have to leave. Tonight." "What about Dad?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't think he'll come with us. Not anymore." I didn't argue. Deep down, I knew she was right. That evening, as we packed what little we could carry, I went to say goodbye to Dad. He was sitting in his chair by the window, staring out at the forest like always. His expression was vacant, his body slouched and still. "Dad," I said, stepping closer, "we're leaving. You should come with us." He didn't respond. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but the moment my hand made contact, he jerked upright, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "They're watching," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They've always been watching." "Who?" I asked, my throat tightening. He turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "The trees. The forest. Him. He doesn't let you leave." I backed away, my heart pounding. "We're leaving tonight," I said, trying to sound firm. "You don't have to stay." Dad laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You can try," he said, "but he always comes back." That night, as Mom and I loaded the car, the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows stretching farther than seemed natural. "Hurry," Mom said, glancing nervously toward the trees. But as I grabbed the last bag from the porch, I froze. Danny was standing at the edge of the yard. His face was pale, his clothes damp and streaked with mud. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at us, his head tilted slightly to the side. "Get in the car," Mom hissed, pulling me toward the vehicle. I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands shaking as Mom started the engine. But before we could pull away, Danny stepped forward. He was faster than he should have been, crossing the yard in seconds. He slammed his hands against the driver's side window, his face inches from Mom's. "Don't leave," he said, his voice low and menacing. Mom screamed, throwing the car into reverse. The tires screeched as we sped backward down the driveway, but Danny didn't follow. He just stood there, watching, his silhouette framed by the glow of the porch light. As we turned onto the road, I looked back one last time. Danny was gone, but the forest seemed closer than before, its shadows spilling out onto the yard, reaching toward the house. We drove for hours, not stopping until the sun began to rise. Mom kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as though expecting to see something following us. "We're safe now," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Mom didn't respond. When we finally stopped at a motel, the relief was overwhelming. The room was small and plain, but it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in weeks, I thought maybe we could escape whatever had taken Danny. But that night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the whisper, "Let me in." I turned toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. There, on the other side of the glass, was Danny. But it wasn't Danny. His face was stretched, his eyes black as voids, his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. His hand pressed against the glass, leaving smudged, muddy prints. "You can't run," he said, his voice layered with something ancient and terrible. "He won't let you." And then he was gone. It's been months now. We never went back to the house, never told anyone what happened. But no matter where we go, I feel him. At night, I hear the whispers. Sometimes, I wake to find muddy footprints outside my door. And sometimes I dream of the forest. In those dreams, Danny is waiting for me, standing among the trees, his arms outstretched. And every time, I hear his voice. "Come home." Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.